All right, so let's dive into Alan Carr's easy way to stop smoking. A lot of people want to know, like, why does it work for some people and just totally flops for others? Um, and I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery, isn't it? You have this book and this whole method that basically says quitting smoking is easy, and that kind of flies in the face of what we usually hear about quitting.
Yeah, you're right. Usually it's all about like the struggle and willpower and, like chewing nicotine gum for weeks on end. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be this huge challenge.
Right, exactly. But Carr's method, it actually has these incredibly high success rates. I mean, like 90 to 95% in some of his clinics. So something about it is definitely working, but that's what makes it even more confusing when it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah, totally. So before we get into why it might not work for some people, maybe we should kind of break down like what makes Carr's approach so different in the first place.
Well, I think a big part of it is this idea that quitting smoking isn't actually about giving up something you really enjoy. Carr calls this the pleasure myth. He says that smoking doesn't really give you pleasure, it just gives you temporary relief from the discomfort you get from the last cigarette.
Okay, so it's like we're not addicted to the pleasure of smoking, but to the relief of not feeling bad. That's
Yeah.
that's kind of a weird way to think about it.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. And Carr uses this analogy, like a mouse in a cage. And the mouse can press a lever to get a break from electric shocks, but the lever also gives another shock. So the shocks are kind of like the cravings and the bad stuff from smoking, and the lever is like the cigarette. So the mouse thinks it's getting pleasure, but really it's just keeping itself in this miserable cycle.
Wow. Okay, that's a really powerful analogy. So if the pleasure isn't real, then what is it that actually keeps people smoking?
Well, nicotine, of course. But Carr doesn't just say nicotine is addictive. He goes deeper and explains how the addiction actually works. Nicotine gets into your bloodstream super fast and then leaves just as quickly. So you end up on this up and down roller coaster of craving and then getting temporary relief.
So you're always chasing that next cigarette just to feel normal again.
Exactly. And here's the thing that I think is super interesting. Carr says that nicotine withdrawal isn't actually this horrible, painful thing that everyone imagines. It's more like this feeling of emptiness and insecurity, almost like low-level anxiety that we just kind of accept as normal.
So we don't even realize we're in withdrawal half the time. We just think we're having a bad day and need a smoke to feel better.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And because we don't realize it's withdrawal, we think the relief we get is from the cigarette itself and not from the absence of nicotine.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky.
Yeah.
So we've got this physical addiction to nicotine, but then there's also this whole mental thing going on too, right? Like the brainwashing you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Carr argues that we're constantly bombarded with messages that make us think smoking is good for us in some way. Think about how smoking used to be portrayed in movies. It was glamorous and sophisticated.
Yeah, it's true. Every cool character in old movies always had a cigarette.
Yeah.
And those old cigarette ads, they were like works of art, all designed to make smoking seem cool.
Exactly. And it wasn't just media either. Think about how normal smoking was back in the day, even when we knew it was bad for you. Or how people focused on the cost of cigarettes instead of the health risks, which Carr sees as a total distraction.
So it's like we were basically programmed to think smoking wasn't that bad and even to see some benefits in it.
Yeah, and Carr calls this the prison of the mind. We get trapped by our own beliefs even when they're harmful.
So if we're all caught in this trap of addiction and brainwashing, how does Carr's method actually help people break free?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, and that's also where we start to see why it might work for some people but not for others. But I think maybe we should talk about that after a quick break.
Sounds good to me. We'll be right back to talk more about how Carr's method helps people see quitting in a whole new way.
So we were talking about how smoking is more about like not feeling bad than it is about actually enjoying it. And that nicotine keeps us hooked even when we don't realize it. So how does Alan Carr's method like actually deal with that and make quitting seem easy?
Well, a big part of it is how he changes the way you think about quitting. He says you're not actually giving up anything important. You're not like depriving yourself. Instead, you're getting free from this thing that's been hurting you.
Oh, okay. So instead of focusing on what you're losing, you're focusing on what you're gaining. That's pretty smart.
Yeah, it is. And that's one of the reasons why it might work better for some people than others. If you can really get your head around that idea, quitting starts to feel less like a sacrifice and more like you're winning something.
Yeah, it takes away that feeling of like, oh man, I'm really missing out, which can totally mess up people's attempts to quit. Exactly. And Carr also talks about the fear of withdrawal, which he says is usually way worse in our heads than it is in reality. Remember, he says that nicotine withdrawal isn't really this horrible, painful thing. It's more of a subtle discomfort that we just think is normal.
Right, it's like that constant background noise that you don't even notice until it's gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by explaining what withdrawal really is, Carr kind of takes away its power. It becomes just a little annoying thing, not this huge obstacle.
Okay, so he's changing the way we think about quitting, and he's saying withdrawal isn't that bad. But does he actually give people specific things to do? Like, what do you actually do with the easy way?
Well, Carr's method is actually pretty simple. He doesn't say you should gradually cut down or use things like nicotine patches or gum. He thinks those things just make it take longer and keep you mentally stuck on smoking.
So it's more like cold turkey. You just decide to stop, and that's it.
Kind of, but it's not just about willpower. It's about really convincing yourself that you're done with smoking for good.
So you have to, like, flip a switch in your brain and go from being a smoker to a non-smoker instantly.
That's the idea. He wants you to stop thinking of yourself as a smoker who's trying to quit and start thinking of yourself as a non-smoker, period.
That's a big change in how you see yourself.
Yeah.
But does it really work that way for people?
Well, that's where individual differences come in and why it might work for some, but not for others. Some people are just better at making big changes like that, while others might need to take things slower.
It makes you wonder if your personality has something to do with it. Like, are some people just more likely to be successful with Carr's method?
That's an interesting thought. Maybe people who are really good at making decisions or people who are okay with challenging their own beliefs might find it easier.
And you also have to think about how long someone's been smoking. If you've been smoking for years and years, it must be really hard to break that habit.
Absolutely. The longer you've been smoking, the harder it gets. And that could be another reason why Carr's method doesn't work for everyone. Someone who's only smoked for a few years might have an easier time quitting than someone who's been smoking a pack a day for decades.
Yeah, it's like anything else, the more you do something, the harder it is to stop doing it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to realize that there's no single way to quit smoking that works for everyone. It's about finding what works for you based on your personality, how long you've been smoking, and how you think about things.
So it's not just about reading Carr's book and poof, you're a non-smoker. You have to take what he says and figure out how it applies to you.
Exactly. And that's why we're spending this whole episode talking about the details of Carr's method and why it works so well for some people, while others just don't get it. But before we finish up, maybe we should talk about some of the criticisms of Carr's approach and why it's been a bit controversial.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not everyone agrees with Carr, and some doctors especially aren't too happy with how he dismisses things like nicotine replacement therapy.
That's definitely one of the biggest criticisms. And I think talking about those criticisms will help us understand the method's strengths and weaknesses even better.
For sure. Let's get into that now. So we were talking about some of the criticisms of Alan Carr's method and how some doctors aren't really on board with it.
Yeah, and a lot of the criticism comes from how Carr kind of dismisses those nicotine replacement things like the patches and gum.
Yeah, I can see that. A lot of doctors think those things are really helpful, especially for people who have been smoking a long time or who have tried to quit before and haven't been able to.
Yeah, they're like, hey, those things can be a really useful tool, because they can help people deal with the physical withdrawal while they're working on the mental and emotional side of quitting.
Right. It's like they're saying, okay, we get it. The mental part is important, but you can't just ignore the fact that your body is physically addicted to nicotine. So for some people, just changing their mindset might not be enough. They might need some extra help to get over those cravings.
Yeah, and there's a concern that if people try to quit cold turkey, like Carr suggests, especially if they've been smoking heavily for a long time, they might just end up failing, and that can be really discouraging. It can make them think, oh, I guess I'm just not strong enough to quit.
That makes sense. It's like maybe Carr's method is a little too extreme. It focuses on the mental stuff, which is good, but it doesn't really acknowledge that the physical addiction is real and that some people might need more support to deal with it.
And I think it's really important to remember that Carr's book isn't meant to be like medical advice or anything. It's more about a different way of thinking about smoking.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really deal with the physical side of addiction in the same way that doctors and treatments can.
So it's not really about whether Carr is right or wrong. It's more about understanding that different things work for different people. And sometimes the best way to quit is to use a bunch of different strategies together.
Definitely, quitting smoking is a very personal thing. What works for one person might not work for someone else. It's all about finding the tools and methods that you feel good about, whether that's Carr's method or nicotine replacement therapy or support groups or even all of those things combined.
Okay, so we've talked about the criticisms of how Carr views nicotine replacement.
Yeah.
But what about like the long-term effectiveness of his method? Even if you manage to quit cold turkey, is there still a chance you'll start smoking again later on?
There's always a risk of relapse with any addiction, really, and smoking is no different. Life throws you curveballs, you get stressed out. Old habits are hard to break completely.
So what does Carr say about those times when you feel tempted to smoke again?
He says the most important thing is to remember why you quit in the first place. Think about all the good things you've gained. Like better health, more energy, and not constantly craving cigarettes. He wants you to see those cravings not as a sign that you're weak, but as a chance to remind yourself that you're a non-smoker now.
So basically, don't beat yourself up if you feel tempted. Just remember all the reasons why you decided to quit and use that to stay strong.
Right. He also says it's a good idea to find healthy ways to deal with stress and avoid things that make you want to smoke. That could be exercising or meditating or spending time in nature or really anything that helps you relax without needing a cigarette.
So it's like finding new healthy habits to replace the old unhealthy ones.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to understanding that quitting smoking and staying quit is a journey. It's something you have to keep working at. It takes being aware of yourself, taking care of yourself, and being willing to try different things as you go.
This has been a really interesting conversation, and I think we've learned a lot about Alan Carr's method. So to wrap things up for our listeners, here's the takeaway. Carr's Easy Way is a really interesting method that has helped a ton of people quit smoking, but it's not some magical solution. It works by changing how you see smoking, getting rid of those ideas that it's pleasurable or that withdrawal is horrible, and giving you the power to quit for good.
But it's also really important to remember that everyone is different, and what works for one person might not work for another. Some people might love Carr's straight-to-the-point style, while others might need to take things slower or get help from medicine or therapy.
The important thing is to figure out what you need and what you feel good about. And remember that quitting smoking is a journey. There will be tough times, but if you have the right attitude and the right support, you can totally break free from this addiction. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Alan Carr's Easy Way to Stop Smoking. We hope you found it helpful, and we encourage you to keep learning and finding what works best for you on your journey to a healthier life.